Alright, now that we know that data validation helps us control what can be entered into our spreadsheet, now let's actually apply some data validation to this little table here. So we have date in the first column, first name, last name, region, zip code, and age. Now the first type of data validation that I want to introduce to you is a drop-down list. Creating drop-down lists is one of the more common types of data validation that we use in Excel. And by using drop-down lists, it makes data entry a lot easier, reduce input errors, and typing mistakes. And this helps a lot with reporting accuracy. So if we look at our table, which column would be a good fit to have a drop-down list for? Well, the date column would not be that good of a fit because there would be so many dates within our drop-down list. And the first name, last name, zip code, and age can vary quite a bit, so you would have a huge drop-down list. So for this example, we will be applying a drop-down list within the region column. So to apply data validation to a cell, the first thing that we have to do is to select the cell that we want to apply the data validation to. So let's click in cell E3, and then we can come up to the Data tab and select Data Validation. Now to create a drop-down list, we have to click this drop-down arrow and select List. But we have to tell Excel what to include in our list. So that's what this source box is. In here we can start typing what we want to include in our list. Let's just use the same regions that we have been working with, which is North. And to separate the values, we have to put a comma. And then we can do South, comma, West, and East. And if we click OK, and if you notice, there's a little drop-down arrow that showed up in our cell. And if we give that a click, we have our 4 options: North, South, West, or East region. We can select any one of these and it will input it into the cell. So if I select West, now West is in that cell. And if I try to input anything else other than those 4 options, it will give me an error. For example, if I did Midwest and click enter, I get an error message saying this value doesn't match the data validation restrictions defined for this cell. So once again, this really helps with reporting accuracy because we are controlling what the user can input into our spreadsheet. Now if I click cancel, it will put the last value that I had in that cell. Now let's go back to data validation and take a look at our source again. So if we click data validation, here in our source, we manually had to write in these values to include them in the drop-down list. Well, sometimes it might not be just 4 items. We could have 20 to 50 items within our drop-down list, and editing the values within this source box can be a little tedious. So instead of actually typing these values in the source box, we can pull values from our spreadsheet itself. So let's walk through on how to do that. We can click cancel to get out of this, and then somewhere in our workbook, either on this spreadsheet or another spreadsheet, we can start entering the values that we want in our drop-down list. I'm just going to come over to column L and then start typing in my values into these cells. So we have North, South, West, and East. Alright, now that we got these values in place, we can click our cell again, go back up to data validation, move this window a little bit so we can see our values, clear out our source box, and all we have to do is select the cells in our spreadsheet that have our values in them. So we can come over here, select our cells, and click OK. Now if we take a look at our drop-down list, it still has all of our values. And the neat thing about this is if we change one of these values where our data validation is pulling from, it will update our drop-down list. For example, instead of North, we can put North East. And if I click Enter, come back to our drop-down list, now our drop-down list includes Northeast. I'm going to undo that action by pressing Ctrl Z as in zebra. Now there's one other way that we can pull values from our spreadsheet to include in our drop-down list, which is creating a named range. So to create a named range, all we have to do is select the cells that we want to include in our name range, then come up to the name box next to our formula bar and give it a name. And let's type in regions. Click Enter. Now those 4 cells have a name of regions. So if we go back to our cell where our drop-down list is, then come up to data validation, instead of the source being L3 through L6, we can just type in the equal sign and then type in our named range, which is regions. And if we click OK and take a look at our drop-down list, our regions are still there. So depending on your needs, there are multiple ways to include values in our drop-down list. And if I have the values on the same sheet where our data validation is pulling from, I like to hide that column because those values can be a little bit distracting. Because if a user opens up this spreadsheet and then sees these values, they're going to wonder why those values are there. And ultimately, they might come in and mess up the items that we need to be included in our drop-down list. So what I like to do is select the column that we have our values in, give this column a right click, and hide the column. Even though that the column is hidden, if we come back to our drop-down list, our values are still there. So that's how you create an Excel drop-down list using data validation.